Good stuff. Right, let's get comfortable, make ourselves comfy. Well, good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much for attending this session and sticking around for the end of the day, where we're between you and some drinks, kindly provided by Cisco, I gather. Hello to everybody joining us online as well. Really appreciate that. And thank you to the National Cybersecurity Centre for inviting me along to this. I'm Jeff White. I'm an author and investigative journalist. Obviously covered cyber for quite a while. I was the co-host of the BBC's podcast series, The Lazarus Heist, which looked into how North Korea had become a computer hacking power. Quick plug, there is going to be a new series of The Lazarus Heist coming out very soon. It's been renamed by the BBC Cyber Hack. Not my choice. But it's going to be taking a very, very deep dive into ransomware and one of the world's most vicious ransomware gangs. We've got some quite amazing stuff. And obviously, ransomware is something we're going to be discussing, I'm sure, with Paul Chichester, Chich, who, as many of you will know, is Director of Operations for the National Cybersecurity Centre. Listen, I've got tons of questions to throw at Chich, inevitably, that's kind of my job. But this really is your session. I mean, you guys have been around, and folks have been around for a very long time covering this. So we want to hear from you. I want to hear what you've been seeing over the last 10 years, what's not been sorted out, what you're seeing at the moment, what needs doing, and where you see things going in the future, what you're concerned about. Slido is available. Please do throw some questions. Otherwise, it's just going to be me, and it's your session as well. So let's get started, if that's OK.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Looking back 10 years, I was sort of delving back into my memory of 2016, which I was still at Channel 4 News at that point. And I remember I was trying to think back to the stuff I was covering, and it is interesting to look at the changes. A lot of the stuff around that time that I was trying and mostly failing to get on air was data breaches, massive data, the Yahoo data breach and all that kind of thing. Those don't seem to be top of mind in terms of cyber coverage now. Are those big data breaches not happening? Are we just paying less attention to them? Where has that gone as an issue, as a story?
They certainly haven't gone away. I think that is still a regular, sadly repeating story that's out there. I think we still see criminals and states targeting that sort of bulk data. I think there is work that perhaps sort of industry and victims themselves are doing to maybe sort of better protect against that, but it is still definitely a threat we see out there. And I mean, this is sort of one of the things that I think this is very much a kind of an interesting question, and there'll be others where they're more about conversations. What's our lived experience in that space? Are different countries seeing different kind of sort of threats play out? From our point of view, it is still there. I think, and it's interesting you say, sort of struggling to get on air, because I think from my point of view, it's still hard for us to translate and describe the real impact of some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, it came up in the other panel. One of the questions that I think David asked was about, what could we have done better over the years? And I think communication to a much wider audience about the real impact and therefore the real threat. And I think there is still a lot of work we collectively need to do in that space. So the threat is still there. We're still seeing it. It is not getting perhaps enough airtime because maybe we're just not communicating it quite in the right way.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the problems we have as journalists as well, is cyber stories are interesting in that you have a bang and then silence, and often it's months, sometimes years later, you actually work out this thing that we're seeing now is actually linked back, and you put all the pieces together, which is quite frustrating. It's as a day-to-day news person, it's difficult for cyber journalists.
And I think, I'm a massive fan of that sort of storytelling, and you've done fantastic work in that space. There's written stuff out there as well, some really good authors. I think it's telling that story, and very often some of these things don't have a story on day one. As you found, it takes a lot of hard yards to tell the story over a long period of time, and then it becomes hugely impactful. And I think it's that kind of medium that we need to find.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to pick up on as well, was looking back 10 years ago, what we were covering. For me to tell a story, you need sort of three things. And conveniently, those three things are contained in the opening sequence of Star Wars, like the original Star Wars, the real Star Wars. You need a victim, a villain, and a hero, really, to tell a story. And in the opening sequence of Star Wars, obviously, you have Princess Leia, who at that point is depicted as a victim, a villain, Darth Vader, and you have the heroes of Luke Skywalker. It was interesting around that time, about 10 years ago, getting heroes is never usually a problem, because folks like the National Crime Agency, the NCSC, they want to come out, and tell the story. Getting victims was difficult, but not impossible. And I will say one of the awkward things about that was the crime gangs started outing victims and putting them on the dark web and so on. But getting villains was really difficult. Around that time, 10 years ago, we had attribution start to happen. And the key moment I remember was Obama, US president at that point, attributing the Sony Pictures Entertainment hack to North Korea.
Yeah.
It was a bit of a breakthrough. For journalists, it really helped us tell the story because we had more of those components. But I wonder, has that had unintended consequences? Because now there's a lot of drive to attribute, which there wasn't before.
Yeah.
Is that all good, or do you think there's issues around that's caused some problems that we didn't see?
I mean, certainly as states, as countries, we talk about this a lot. There are, I think, it's a real live debate about how attributions do or don't deter and counter the threat. I think from our point of view, we would never say it's a silver bullet, but I think there are layers to why we do it and the value we get from it. I think one is obviously, to some degree, setting what we think are norms around cyberspace and what is and isn't acceptable in that space. And a lot of the attribution that the UK has certainly done has been thoughtful about what we are describing and what we're calling out. I think there is something also, though, about communication and actually giving maybe a face to the threat and making it easier to understand. I think I have certainly found personally that asking organizations to do things just because we think it's a good idea isn't as successful as saying, you need to do this because we know that this threat actor is targeting you.
And threat actor would be this country.
And this country, this group, this APT or whatever. And I think that real sort of, and maybe that's, we're then starting to tell that story for them. So it's really important, I think, in that storytelling.
Is there a risk, though, and much as I hate to bring up the issue of governments putting pressure on their agencies, particularly at the moment in UK news, but is there pressure sometimes for you to attribute, because it's risky, and often even when you get strong attribution, there's still a margin of error. Have you faced increasing pressure to attribute as attacks have gone on as the last few years?
No, actually, I think there's a number of things there. So we have a sort of independent role in doing that attribution. It's not purely technical. It's an all-source, all-intelligence sort of process that the NCSC leads on behalf of UK government. And actually, the UK government actually has quite a very mature assessment function around supporting policy. So we do a lot of work to, if you like, sort of work out who's done it. And generally, government is looking for a certain level of confidence and a certain level of certainty. So if you see our attributions, you will see us use probabilistic language and confidence language. So we will say the GRU are highly likely to have conducted an operation against a sector, whatever that is, with high confidence. And actually, we have a lot of attributions. So, generally, ministers, the first question very often we will get asked around a table, a crisis response table, is who done it and who did it. And almost sort of from day one, over time, you start out with a hypothesis and then you build up on that confidence. And generally, it's my experience that ministers are very understanding of they don't want to make a mistake either. The last thing they want to do is stand up in the House of Parliament and say something that is not entirely sort of backed up with a lot of confidence. So generally it works really well. I think sometimes there is definitely a desire to do more, certainly around Ukraine, when we were looking to support Ukraine and say, with much more quickly than we would normally do, we think Russia is conducting operations.
Because that's an interesting example of that, because there were instances in Ukraine, as I remember, where in order to get ahead of what were going to be emerging information operations effectively attributed to Russia or attached, we were sort of going out there and saying, look, we know Russia's up to this, and so we are going to announce this, at least according to the agency. So that's why I wonder about that pressure, is that you're almost going one step further and saying, well, we're actually going to pre-announce what we would normally attribute after the fact.
But again, I think that comes down to the intelligence you have. And actually, a big part of our job, ideally, is getting indicators and warnings before an attack. Actually, a lot of the work of my team is going out and doing notifications to organizations to stop an attack. So actually, there's a significant number of ransomware attacks we stop because we are able to alert a victim that they've got precursor malware or they're being targeted. The same goes for other state attacks. So, and we can still be confident about the attribution to that. So it's not, I think, a lot of our work is about preemptive attribution, almost, if I can sort of describe it like that. So almost if you understand the actors that are most likely to cause some of those events, having a lot of understanding beforehand is probably one of the biggest parts of our mission.
The other thing I want to pick up on, this is another sort of retrospective question, was thinking back again, 10 years ago or thereabouts, there was an alphabet soup of entities dealing with cyber. So as a journalist, I'm going to National Crime Agency, I'm going to National Cybersecurity Centre, Cabinet offices looking at government security. We've got City of London Police doing stuff around, particularly around things like copyright theft, I remember, and financial crime and so on. All these different entities. There's a panel earlier about the cybercrime threat, and this came up. I don't see that as different. Has anything been done to reconcile those things together? Where is the coordination? Is it better? Has that changed? Because I haven't seen it.
There is a huge amount of coordination, and I think to some degree, you can tell through the variety of speakers that are here and how hopefully we all recognise our individual parts on the pitch. And this is not a single player sport, and so I think you have to look at how we all play to our strengths, but ultimately be very, very coordinated and coherent. So certainly on incidents would be a good example. If we're dealing with a major ransomware incident, we are constantly working closely with the NCA or the ROCU or the element of law enforcement that's working on that. We have a number of embedded staff in the teams. We share pretty much everything we see. So I think, and we've definitely looked at this over the years, that can you create some kind of single entity that can do it all? But actually, we all have different statutory purposes as well.
I get that, but is there, and I don't know the answer to this question, is there an annual meeting, for example, or a quarterly meeting where someone senior from NCSC, MI5, MI6, NCA, City of London Police, the other entities, Cabinet Office, Foreign Office, and so on, gets together in one room and just looks at what they're all dealing with and deconflicts that and makes sure that you're...
It's literally, those kind of conversations happen daily.
Right.
So it's definitely not as sort of, as formal as that. Yes, we do have, so, Richard will sit down with his opposite numbers in certain agencies and we'll do that. But I think, we really try and move away from that and have a much more organic, joined-up offer to the UK. And I think that was definitely something that we recognised as, when we set the NCSC up. So for instance, I mean, you can report to us or you can report to law enforcement. You end up at the same point behind the scenes. So we're immediately sort of sharing that situational awareness between us.
Yes.
And then, I mean, what we're trying to do is...
Sorry to interrupt, but I understand how reactive that can help, but strategically, that sounds like a reaction to a thing that happened. Is there a sort of...
So certainly on the, I mean, a couple of examples, I suppose. I mean, I think you won't be surprised, and people won't be surprised to know that, with the NCA, for instance, we both actively investigate threats to understand, get ahead of that, to understand that, to disrupt that. And so we have joint investigations, we have joint campaigns. I mean, that's one thing that I think we are very, as a tool of how we do that coordination, we talk a lot about campaigning and how we build those campaigns to tackle a threat or an issue. I mean, the Mythos sort of AI story is a really good example, again, where we are constantly just sharing our understanding and making sure that whichever bit of government you sort of go to, you should be getting the joined-up view.
Well, so I understand it's Anthropic sharing its understanding.
Because
they've got the understanding thanks to their AI, is that not?
And, I mean, we're very fortunate to have AC in the UK. And so obviously AC is the sort of lead in terms of that engagement. So you don't want every bit of government sort of engaged in that. But again, it's sort of making sure that our expertise is playing into AC's understanding and vice versa. As an example. I mean, another good example, just to sort of think slightly differently, is more on the resilience side. So we do a lot of comms campaigns. And if you look, they are all joined up. You don't anymore get a City of London campaign, an NCSC campaign, an NCA campaign, in terms of how we actually communicate the threat and how we communicate fixing some of those things, we work very collaboratively to have that single campaign, be it a comms campaign, be it a campaign to deal with a threat, or be it a campaign to deal with the technology that's emerging.
I'm looking on the iPad here, and I've just realized live on stage that I am in the era of bifocals. So I'm going to have to take these off. Now I can see, that's fine. I'm just going to put those down there. But while I'm scanning through the questions, which I can now focus on, I just want to ask as well, so done a bit of historic stuff there. I want to bring it sort of more up to date at the moment, particularly the world in which we live at the moment, which I don't think anybody could argue with the statement that we're living in a more fractured world, a more polarized world at the moment. And I want to look at how that sort of beds into cyber and the work of the National Cybersecurity Centre, but also the work that folks in this room are doing. I want to look particularly at the relationship with the US. Our relationship with the US is just not as solid as it was. I don't think anybody can argue with that. That's causing fallout in various different areas. We see it politically very, very acutely. In terms of the work the National Cybersecurity Centre does, and it will do this with entities in the US, you can't tell me the relationship hasn't changed. You can't tell me there's not some impact of that. What is the impact on the ground? Or are you saying, actually, no, nothing, everything's fine. The people we deal with are not affected by this change in the special relationship?
I think genuinely it's not. I mean, I think, and it's interesting you sort of, you can't argue that, it hasn't had an effect all around. I think I can. I mean, my lived experience is working with the US and US partners. They're people we've built relationships with over years, over decades. Operationally, we have successes. And so at an operational level, and as an operational person, not a politician, I can only speak to that sort of experience. But I would say that our relationship with CISA, with CSD and NSA, with the FBI, is hugely load-bearing. We talk to them again almost daily, if not daily. I think the other thing that I would just dig under the surface there is that this is a team sport, and it's not underpinned by some nice sort of feeling that we should collaborate. There are real hard reasons why we can only get after these threats by working together. And at an operational level, that is what drives that collaboration. We all recognize that there are some threats that we have to work together on, and I see that happening today in some areas more than ever, actually.
On the issue of the world becoming a more fractured place, I did ask, ahead of this, I asked some various people for questions that might feed into this and put out some feelers.
I was worried you would.
Yeah. One of them came from this is a chief executive of I will describe it as a big cybersecurity company. In a changing geopolitical world, what is the UK considering with data sovereignty and to build sovereign capability? And someone else actually asked that question as well.
This is going to sound like a political answer. It depends what you mean by data sovereignty. I think from our
British citizens' data on British soil would be how I would define that.
So I think there's a few things there. I think actually post-COVID, we've all recognised that some of those globalised elements can introduce risk, but I don't think your solution is necessarily to avoid them. And so data sovereignty, I would always say, what threat or what risk are you trying to mitigate? Because, as I say, as a cyber world, a lot of the threats that manifest against your data are transnational and come from all around the world. And it doesn't matter necessarily whether you store it all in your country or another country. Most of the real threats you worry about will be going after that data wherever it is. And so I think there's something that we would definitely say to organizations is really understand where your data is. You can't outsource risk. So if you think that by giving your data to somebody, either in your own country or another country, you are somehow transferring risk, you're not. And so
you're a bit less exposed though, aren't you? So if you're, at least we know, well, we'd hope to know what the threats to the UK are. If your data's stored in another country and that country does something which is objected to by somebody else on the world stage, that country's attacked and your data is attacked, as a corollary of the fact you put it over there.
Yes, but I think that at that point then you're thinking more, from our point of view, we would be saying to people, you should be thinking about making your data resilient. And so having your data necessarily in one place is not necessarily a good approach, regardless of what those threats are. I mean, you genuinely want to be thinking about how your data is federated, how your data is backed up, how your data's accessible to you when you need it. And I think I certainly would say that what you need to be doing as an organization now is recognizing the world is more complex, and wherever you put your data, you should be thinking about being resilient in the face of some of those geopolitical and sort of global threats. And so just bringing it into your own geographic region might offer you some mitigation for some threats, but certainly doesn't give you some kind of incredible protection against that.
By the way, you touched on the AI anthropic mythos stuff. That I didn't miss that. We will loop back to that because obviously contractually we're obliged to talk about AI in every session now. But there was a question came in, and this actually ties into some of the stuff we've been talking about. By the way, all the questions here are all anonymous, which I think says something about the audience. Should we be concerned about the source and location of cyber threats, or should we just focus on defending against them? Which I find interesting, that ties into the... You sort of started to answer that in terms of messaging to victims and attribution being part of that. But I have heard that in the industry. Of, look, I don't care, if I'm getting attacked, I just want to stop the bleeding. Yeah. It's not my job to work out who's behind it, who's doing it.
And I think there are different parts of an organization that might care differently, and your mileage will vary depending on the organization you are, your geopolitical exposure, your global footprint. So for instance, if you're an international company at the moment with offices, data, interests in the Gulf region, there will be a set of specific threats that you might need to worry about that are different, if you're a company that has a slightly different footprint. So I do think increasingly companies and defenders need to have a greater understanding of the geopolitical context that they're working in. Whether that means you need to care about every APT and also its fidelity. Do you care whether it's Russia, or do you care whether it's actually Russia, a particular part of the GRU, a particular part of that unit? And we might, very often we will disclose a GRU unit down to that unit level. Again, that is important for us, but it's not necessarily important for every organization to know that. But I do think for us, threat intelligence is layered in sort of strategic, operational, and tactical. And the best companies that we work with have that tiered approach. They use that strategic understanding to drive strategic risk management, but also you need that tactical as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. For me, it's just a matter of curiosity. I find I'm not in the situation of having to fend off attacks. I'm in a privileged position, but wanting to know who's behind this, I just find that a natural thing. But anyway, that's just me. Can we talk about ransomware? Because obviously, identified this morning by Richard Horne as being, I think, the biggest threat to the UK. So one of the sort of people I reached out to for questions was my mum, obviously. I'm going to be... What does mum want to know about cybersecurity? My mum just dictates quite a lot of actually the trajectory of what I end up covering. But what she said, basically she had one question, which was, Marks & Spencer's, all this stuff, Jaguar, she's read all the headlines. What have you done? What's changed? What's different as of today, given everything we had, all the hell we had last year? So go on, what have you done? Answer my mum's question.
So I think, so one of the things actually that's really important around those incidents, and actually you touched on earlier, sort of the victims being anonymous, actually having events like that touch everybody's lives, potentially. And so as a communications vehicle, it becomes incredibly powerful. And I think we have seen a really significant response from industry and organizations following those attacks. So thinking about our role in making sure that we can support organizations in what they do about that. And so a lot of our work is about giving advice and guidance, often specifically to certain threats. So that's a sort of one element operationally. I think as you move more sort of strategically up the stack, if you like, this plays into some really important supporting evidence for things like the Cybersecurity Resilience Bill. So the UK already has legislation that is going through Parliament, and a lot of the things that we're trying to do there are ensure that there is more regulation to drive greater resilience in the UK. I think that, there are other things we're doing, but I sort of sense the next question. So I kind of feel that also those point incidents didn't tell us something we didn't know about the threat. So it wasn't that we would then go and start doing 16 new things.
Yeah.
What I think it makes us do is never be complacent, not that we would be, but really recognize they are reminders of just the impact it can have in that space.
Yeah, not entirely sure your answers would have satisfied my mum, but we'll find out when I get the next call home on Sunday. But but actually, to double down on that, in the wake of that, is NCSC making calls, for want of a better phrase, to retailers and saying, look, you've seen what happens? Is there that kind of proactive? How many calls are you making?
100%, actually. And so the NCSC runs a huge network of interaction with pretty much every sector in the UK. And we have information exchanges with many of the C&I sectors. We have trust groups for all of those. So we have a retailer trust group, which has all of those companies in that. And so, again, almost, every sort of thing that happens, be it a ransomware attack, be it a change in the geopolitical landscape, we're using those platforms to reach out and say, right, this is what it means for you. So we have very targeted advice. We use those trust groups not just for us to communicate to. Obviously, we gain a huge amount, but also it's about creating a forum for those sectors and those companies to come and talk to each other. So there has been a huge amount of engagement across all of those sectors. As I say, when some of those threats change and when we think that there is something that we really need to discuss. But no, there is a lot of sort of outreach in that space.
Okay. By the way, if I'm missing anything here, get on Slido and tell me. I don't have all the questions, certainly not all the answers. But on ransomware, we've obviously got the government proposals about what we can do about ransom. That is something in the offing that you can explain to people. We've got various sort of ideas of what could happen, a range of options, all the way up to restricting people's ability to pay ransoms. To the extent that you can, what would you want to see happen? Which were the what do you think is a sensible thing to do of the range of options we've been given?
I mean, I'll speak very personally as the sort of director of ops, and so as part of my responsibility, sort of responsible for that national incident management arena. So we spend a lot of time talking to the victims of ransomware. We spend a lot of time dealing with the sort of consequences of it. I think from our point of view, on me personally, transparency. So I think that we are not exposing the real threat to the nation. I'm not sure companies are exposing the real threat to their shareholders, to their audit and account committees. I think there is still a lack of transparency in the impact that some of these things are having. So actually, I mean, you could easily start, I think, with not getting into some of the sort of more discussed areas of banning ransomware payments, but actually saying you should be disclosing this. Why
that edges towards one of the solutions, which is a reporting register where you
absolutely
say,
yeah.
So that's something.
And not necessarily reporting. I mean, I think one of the things that we also want as a government is to understand the full impact. I think ultimately, we will always calibrate our response based on the data we've got, and having a mechanism that allows us to really understand the scale of the threat, but also I think helps us all to understand what that is. And I think ultimately what will drive the right behavior in organizations is almost never going to be government. A person from the government coming along and telling you what to do isn't always the most welcome visit. Actually, your board, your shareholders, your audit committee telling you what to do is usually far more effective, in my experience. And so making sure that they have an understanding of some of that impact, I think is really important. I mean, it goes beyond that. It goes into also, I think, being transparent about your posture on cybersecurity, and a lot of the work we do with boards, which is trying to make sure that boards hold their own organizations to account, that their non-exec directors hold their organizations to account.
Yeah, interesting. just thinking how it would work in an organization. But let's move on. I still want to stay on ransomware, though. And from the sublime to the ridiculous, I obviously asked my mum. I also asked some ransomware gangs what they wanted to ask you.
Okay.
Because obviously some of these ransomware gangs will communicate with journalists, they communicate with victims, and so they have open channels. So I put the call out and said, look, what would you like to ask? Senior member of UK Intelligence Service. Awkwardly, there was a mix of answers, as you can imagine. And one of the answers that came back was the Chilin ransomware group, who have a pretty grim history, as I'm sure you're aware. Chilin were accused of the ransomware attack on Synovis, the blood testing service, which is working for NHS trusts. Took Synovis down. The NHS trusts subsequently have attributed a death to that incident. They weren't able to help a patient. That patient died. I made contact with Chilin for a documentary made for the BBC last year. They sent us a video, and in the video I asked them, would you attack healthcare again? They said yes. At that point, the death hadn't been announced. So in preparation for this, I asked them again, look, this death has been confirmed, apparently. Chilin replied and said, they pointed me to an interview that they'd done for a website that said, well, we think there were other blood services available, so they could have used it, so I don't think that death is on us. Make of that what you will. Chilin, however, did send me a question for you, and it is as follows. You can't do anything against the hackers, so you attack the victims. Meanwhile, for most companies, paying the ransom is the easiest way to solve the problem. Thus, you don't help, but only harm the victims. How do you respond to this?
So I'd probably pick at least two parts to that question. I think the first, you can't do anything about us. I think I have very close colleagues in law enforcement, both in the UK and the US actually, and around the world, who would beg to differ. I think there is definitely an ongoing effort to try to hold those individuals to account, to disrupt their operations, to extradite them for judicial outcomes. And nobody is saying that is easy. But
there's no charges against Chilin as far as I'm aware. They've not been identified, and they are still going.
But I think, again, actually sort of looking at, ultimately a coordinated response to any of the sort of major ransomware and cybercrime groups, a lot of those things take quite a bit of time. I mean, a really good example is actually the last podcast on the BBC, again, on that, sort of looking at how some of the evil core work. And, that was a long piece of work to ultimately roll up a significant threat. So I think, ultimately that is still a tool that I think governments have that they would say is an important one. So I think there's that. I think just on the second part of that question, which I would tease out about, it's still the sort of easiest thing to do to pay the ransom. I think my response to that would be, by far the easiest thing to do is avoid being ransomed.
Well, yes, not get there in the first place, yeah.
And actually, and whilst that might sound a little bit flippant, it's absolutely the case, that organizations today have a choice. There are things that, organizations can do, be it follow Cyber Essentials, follow other guidance that, is out there. But there is still a huge amount organizations can do that I think is far more cost effective and impactful than ultimately paying a ransom. And I think that is certainly understanding the threat, protecting against it, and also preparing for it. I think, again, I think there's a sort of a little bit of a false narrative in their view. Also, which is just, if you just pay the ransom, life will be good. You will certainly look at some of the impacts that have been reported from last year, and the operational impact is, and all, some cases difficult to quantify. You're talking hundreds, if not billions of pounds. And that still happens. I mean, whether you pay the ransom or not, you've still had that impact.
I mean, HSE in Ireland got the key back, but still spent ages having to...
And exactly that, yeah.
I mean, there's a wibbly-wobbly world I can see where actually the NCSC and the ransomware gangs could find common cause. Because I think the ransomware gangs' response, second-guessing it, would be, well, yeah, you're right, there's loads of great advice out there about safety. And if you don't follow it, we're going to hit you and succeed, and then you'll have to pay us. They literally describe themselves to me sometimes as post-paid penetration testing. Have you heard this phrase?
Yes.
Where they've done the penetration test and you failed, and now you pay. It's just they didn't arrange it in advance. But before we get, I'm just aware, push for time a little bit. AI, the mythos, Anthropic Claude mythos thing. I find myself sort of baffled slightly by the coverage of this, and I think what's happened here is that people, when some of these stories break, people want to be very clever and say clever things, and then don't ask the basic questions. I have no interest in appearing clever. My interest is in working out what the hell's going on. As far as I can work out, in a nutshell, Anthropic unleashed its AI on cyber security. It found loads of vulnerabilities. Anthropic said, well, we're not going to release that to the public, obviously, but we will work with organizations to fix those vulnerabilities, and that's what's happening. So my stupid question is, well, that's a good thing then. Why are people going, some people at least, going so nuts over this? What are we worried about here?
So I think there is significant merit in that analysis. I think you're right that ultimately responsible disclosure and understanding of some of the threats that are emergent as a result of AI is, I think a mitigation to some of those things. I think maybe why, and again, this is, I think, a part of the narrative we would, again, agree with, though, is that what we're seeing here is a real step change in the capability of frontier models. Now, actually, that's not a step change that should cause you to panic, but it is a step change that should cause you to plan and act. And
But just to sort of challenge that, if more AI frontier models in the future spot more cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and then the people behind those frontier models do what Anthropic seems to be doing, of working with companies to solve those vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Again, that sounds, I'm playing slightly devil's advocate, a slightly straw man argument, but that's a good future where AI spots more vulnerabilities and we solve them. Cool.
And I think that is obviously, as the NCC, a world that we would like to see and are encouraging. AI can be absolutely a massive enabler to find vulnerabilities before the adversary.
Yeah.
I think the challenge in that, for all of us, is access to the model.
Right.
So who gets access to the model? Because
somebody that we don't like or control or have links with finds that. Yes.
And so, if you think about vendors, all the vendors, think about all the technology that we use, all the web apps that we use, everything that we use, are we saying, at what point does that become actually, well, it's not a closed model, it's an open model at that point. So I think there is still a lot that we still have to understand about how those models are released, how they are tested and used. And we are still, I think, and I'm sure the frontier AI companies would agree, this is still a space that they are trying to do the right thing. But at some point, how does that break out and all of a sudden that model gets into the hands of people that that can exploit it when the vendors don't or the defenders don't?
Yes, and there's an interesting issue here around the fact that it's a private company that's discovered this thing, and therefore it's the private company that can kind of decide who they work with in terms of. So anyway, I'm aware that we're advancing in time, so I want to go back to a few of the questions in here. And actually, one of them leads naturally on from this. How will NCSC Ops change in the years ahead to tackle AI-driven threats and the proliferation of cyber tools?
So I think, for us, potentially won't be surprised to know that we see AI as a massive productivity gain for us if we can understand how to use it effectively.
Will you get access to the Anthropic? Are you in on that?
So the UK government has access through AISI, so
Right.
they are the people that lead for the UK, and AC is part of DCIT, so they have access, and they are the ones that are doing the testing. So
Some massive patch Tuesday coming up, where it goes on for a month.
well, again, this is, the patches will come from the vendors, so do all the vendors. That's something that Anthropic need to be thoughtful about. But I think from our point of view, really seeing how we can scale, I think there's something about pace for us. So, I don't want this to be too much sort of hyperbole, but I do think we will be in a world in the not too distant future where we are facing more automated attacks, and therefore we need to find ways of having more automated responses. And actually, some of the announcements that I think the security minister made around the sort of cyber shield is, again, the NCSC and UK government's work to think about how we start now to exploit AI technologies to help us at machine speed find vulnerabilities, defend the UK. So I think operationally, it's going to be a really rapidly changing sort of world in that. At one level, it's sort of a huge amount of change, and at another level, not, because the adversaries that are out there in terms of state actors will still be the adversaries that are out there, that were out there 10 years ago and are still out there now. So some things will change, but I think our core mission, if you like, will just continue to adapt. And I'm thoughtful about, the NCSE 10 years ago and before. What we do today is fundamentally different. So there were other catalysts. AI is just a catalyst.
Moving swiftly on, we've got another one here. All day, everyone I can hear the frustration in this question. I get this. All day, everyone has been talking about intelligence sharing and working together to prevent the threats. What is needed for this to actually happen in near real time, rather than through annual reports and, ouch, events like this? I inserted the ouch there. That was my
Editorial.
Practical advice. The person's got a good point. Yeah, intelligence sharing, but go on.
So I think, certainly today, the NCSC does other things along that at machine speed. So we have a program called Share and Defend, which effectively takes a significant amount of data and, again, shares that in real time with organizations. That gives them an insight into the threat. Some of that is working with UK telecoms companies. So what we want to do, and then Bibi sort of alluded to it earlier, where how do we provide DNS protection at scale at a national level? And the NCSC runs protective DNS for large sort of elements of the UK in terms of government and public sector. But we recognise that most organisations use UK telecommunications companies and things like that. We're working with them. They are already running those platforms very often. Our job is to make sure that we are sharing that data. So behind the scenes, minute by minute, second by second, the NCSC is facilitating that kind of real-time intelligence sharing. We run early warning, which is a service that anybody can subscribe to. If you tell us your IP addresses, your domain names, we, again, as a kind of real-time service, will be looking at the things we're seeing. And if we see a threat to you, we will be automatically tipping you. And that feeds in. So I think, there are lots of different things that go on. I mean, we see this in, some really great examples where the NHS and NHS England are working across the sort of very federated world, but providing some amazing services in that. So there is a lot of, I would say, much more sort of real-time work going on. We talk about that in some of these events, but all are important parts of the response.
I'm going to ask you, I'm going to push you for a specific response on this. Be as specific as you can be, because I know what the person's trying to ask, and I think vague responses aren't helpful in this. What is the most interesting or exciting new approach you have seen for countering the threat? What can we do differently? What have you seen, one thing that you've actually seen concrete, somebody's done where you thought, that's smart, I wish loads of people could do that? Specific as you can be.
I'm sort of thoughtful about at an enterprise level or a national level.
Enterprise level, I'll just pick one, enterprise level.
Enterprise level, I'll do both. But enterprise level, I think the smartest thing I've seen, and actually it was some years ago, but it still, I think, was groundbreaking then, and arguably is still for many people not where the level of maturity is having an incredible model that sort of mapped the threats against the countermeasures. And as the threats changed, they effectively mapped that against, okay, which countermeasure blocked that threat? And had a really very sophisticated way of mapping return on investment. And every 6 months said, okay, that countermeasure, how many of those attacks it stopped? And it might be that some of those countermeasures were really effective, but not uniquely effective. And actually, it's therefore not a good return on investment. So that level of sophistication, the way that they operationalized that, even to this day, was, I was in awe of just how sophisticated you can get in this space. Now, that's not necessarily cheap, but it shows that there are ways of countering that threat.
Yeah. Just in terms of coming up against time, I just want to talk about, the industry more broadly. I'm sort of painfully aware, we are two middle-aged white men on stage. For the industry to kind of evolve and to change and to grow, we're going to need different types of people getting involved, people with different backgrounds, with different views and opinions and so on. Again, what have you seen that's smart around getting different people into the industry? How's that looking? It does seem to be getting a bit more diverse gender-wise, maybe, possibly. But more to be done? What can companies do, solid stuff that companies can do?
So I think there's a lot of things they can do. I mean, so cyber first, tech first, that will evolve into. There's a huge amount of fantastic work that's been done over a number of years, like the Girls' School competition. A lot of the work we've done is cyber bursaries to make sure that the intake, if you like, to those is much more balanced, even, not just on gender but ethnicity, and sort of really sort of shaping that pipeline. There are some amazing sort of independent organisations out there now that are at the vanguard of some of these. And there's sort of, I think tomorrow morning there's a breakfast for women in cyber here at the NCSC's event. Really supporting those communities is important. I think just recognising in the first place that you need a mix of minds, you need that diversity of thought in many sort of dimensions. And I think as organisations, certainly for us, really, again, having that concrete action plan and holding yourself accountable to it. And I think I see a lot of organisations having a pledge or sort of doing something that says, yes, we support some of those things, but actually, what's your action plan?
Measure it.
And how do you measure that? And having real metricated answers, which is something we try to do.
One final question, which shot to the top of the scoreboard, and I've obviously saved to last for obvious reasons. And by the way, I should point out these questions, and I hate to bring up the issue of vetting at this particular time in the UK news cycle, but these questions are vetted, and so this one has been given the thumbs up, literally, by NCSC. What's your favourite thing from the GCHQ Gregs? There was a Greg's in GCHQ.
Dear. So my favourite thing from the Gregs, we are very fortunate to have a Gregs in the building in Cheltenham. And my favourite thing is the Belgian bun.
The Belgian bun with the little cherry
thing on top.
That's
Belgian bun with everything.
That's solid as well. Those ones, they were, okay. Approve. All right, so you've got your answer to your question now, those of you who voted that one up. We are out of time. Obviously, the conversation can continue, both the folks at GCHQ and NCSC and other folks out over the drinks. I would just, for my part, say to all of you, thank you for everybody out there in the general public for what you do, for the defensive work that you do. What you do is you care. You are, to go back to the Star Wars example, the heroes in this scene. And I'm aware that you care deeply about the organizations that you work for, that you help defend, and that you work on behalf of to defend. That is fantastic. I would also encourage you to think about your own care of yourself and of each other. In terms of resilience, that is very important. Your organization can be resilient, but for yourself, you need to take care of that as well. So it's a plea, really, to take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Because frankly, when things go bang, we are going to need your help. So please do take good care of yourselves and of each other. Just remains for me to thank, again, the NCSC for inviting us along, and also show your appreciation, please, for Paul Chichester, Director of Operations.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. So, thank you, Jeff, for agreeing to come and be so diligent in finding all those questions and sourcing them from your mum through the ransomware groups and various points in between. So, again, sort of really good. The one thing I would say, I'd echo a lot of those resilience things, but one of the reasons that I thought, this was worth doing is I don't think we have sort of some of those deeper conversations enough as a community. And I'd really sort of welcome that, about how we do that more. We are very often driven by talking about the latest threat or the latest technology or the latest thing. And actually, the way we'll solve some of these things is by being more strategic and thinking about that. And we definitely don't have the answers to that, right? You in this room and the community and the people online are the people that have that. So, to the point of, events like this, they are absolutely vital in creating environments to have those discussions, be it in the bar or on stage or whatever it is. I never fail to leave events, Cyber UK and others, without having learned an incredible amount from all of the people that attend as well, and the talks. And generally, I'm sure you're the same. You go back with a long list of things that you are now going to do or take action on or follow up. So please do see this as a sort of a conversation we want to carry on having. This is the start of a conversation. It's not just a sort of fireside chat about a few things. You will all have opinions. You put the questions in. Come and ask and talk about them a bit more. Please encourage you to do that. Jeff, thank you. Thank you for coming along.